British prisoners swung pickaxes into clay so hard it split their hands open. The air reeked of rot and sweat. Men who'd once marched proudly in uniform now shuffled barefoot through mud, their ribs showing like the bars of a cage. If you stumbled, the guard's rifle butt followed. If you faltered, the sun finished the job. On a good day, maybe a bowl of rice. On a bad day, a bullet. More than 140,000 Allied prisoners of war fell into Japanese hands during World War II. They would learn that captivity under the Imperial Army was not a sentence to imprisonment, but to endurance beyond imagination. They built railways through jungles that seemed to breathe malice. They carried stones the size of tombs. They watched friends die standing up, too weak to fall. And yet, even as these men descended into hell, another kind of madness was unfolding in the skies above the Pacific. A madness born not of cruelty, but of devotion. On the runways of Japan's coastal airfields, young pilots, some barely 20, bowed before their aircraft. Their planes had been painted with cherry blossoms, symbols of purity and death. Each man carried a white silk scarf, a rising sun flag, and a letter to his mother. They were the Kamikaze, divine wind, men ordered to become weapons, to turn their bodies into bombs. It was the ultimate inversion of humanity. One group of men suffering because their captors had been taught that surrender was shame. Another group destroying themselves because their nation believed death was purity. To the Allies, the Japanese soldier became a symbol of fanaticism. To the Japanese themselves, he was a vessel for honor, a soul that could burn brighter in death than in defeat. Between these worldviews lay a gulf so vast it devoured empathy. In the Pacific War, mercy was a casualty. Prisoners became tools, pilots became sacrifices, and in between, the question of what it truly meant to be human grew harder to answer. As Tokyo prepared its youth to die for the Emperor, Allied POWs prayed only to see another sunrise. Both sides were trapped in a spiral of belief and brutality that pushed the limits of endurance, faith, and fear. This is the story of two faces of fanaticism, one that lived too long, and one that chose not to live at all. The story of men who crossed the edge of morality, and those who, against every instinct to give up, somehow didn't. The story of Japanese POW camps and kamikaze pilots, where the war stopped being about nations and became a battle for the soul of mankind itself. To understand the horrors of Japan's POW camps and the birth of the kamikaze, you must first step inside the mind of a nation at war with both the world and itself. In the decades before World War, Japan had transformed from an isolated empire into an industrial and military juggernaut. Yet beneath its modern exterior beat the ancient heart of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was a code rooted in the samurai's creed: loyalty, obedience, and above all, honor unto death. To the Japanese soldier, surrender was not merely defeat, it was spiritual corruption. The captured man in their eyes ceased to exist as a warrior and became less than human. A soldier who lived after losing had forfeited his right to dignity. This belief, twisted by wartime propaganda, became deadly doctrine. The Imperial Army was taught that mercy was weakness, that compassion toward an enemy dishonored both oneself and the emperor. It was a worldview that justified atrocity, not out of hatred, but out of conviction. When Allied troops fell into Japanese hands, they entered a world where suffering was discipline and death was duty. The Japanese High Command had no intention of feeding, housing, or protecting prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions. To them, those treaties were relics of Western morality, irrelevant to an empire forged in divine right. The result was a network of over 600 prison camps stretching from Burma to New Guinea, from Singapore to Manchuria. In places like Changi, Borneo, and the Thai-Burma Death Railway, Allied prisoners were forced to carve rail lines through jungle and rock in blistering heat, often with little more than picks and bare hands. More than 100,000 POWs and laborers died along that railway alone, their bodies buried beneath the very tracks they laid. The Japanese officers overseeing them were not sadists by profession. They were products of an ideology that equated cruelty with control. Starvation, beatings, and executions were the instruments of order. To them, the men breaking beneath their whips were simply reminders of what happens when one fails the emperor. At the same time, Japan itself was being bled dry. By 1944, after years of total war, resources were collapsing, the navy was crippled, and the once mighty air force was burning itself out in the endless skies over the Pacific. The empire faced a truth it could not accept. Defeat was inevitable, but in the Japanese psyche, there was no word for surrender, only for sacrifice. So they created a new kind of soldier. From the ashes of desperation, the kamikaze were born not as a tactic, but as a creed. They were told their deaths would cleanse the nation's shame, that in burning themselves, they could turn back the tide of war. At first, volunteers stepped forward. Later, volunteers were chosen. Entire squadrons of young men, students, poets, sons, were trained not in flying home, but in dying correctly. Their targets were Allied warships approaching the Japanese homeland. Their payloads, 500 kilograms of explosives, and a single human being who believed, or at least hoped, that death could still have meaning. The same culture that starved its captives now sanctified suicide. It was the same logic turned inward. If life without honor was unthinkable, then dying for it was divine. Across the Pacific, Allied soldiers, many of whom had seen what the Japanese were capable of in the camps, now faced an enemy who wouldn't stop coming even in flames. The war in the Pacific had always been brutal, but as Japan's empire began to crumble, its desperation turned apocalyptic. The soldiers in the jungle and the pilots in the sky were two sides of the same tragedy, one destroying others to preserve honor, the other destroying himself for it. And both, in their own way, were swallowed by the machinery of belief. The jungle reeked of sweat, blood, and something metallic, the scent of slow death baked in tropical heat. Along the banks of the Kwai, beneath a sky heavy with monsoon clouds, Lieutenant Thomas Bennett, 27 years old, Royal Engineers, swung his pick into the stubborn red earth. He'd been at the Thanbuseak camp for 8 months, though time had become meaningless. The days were a blur of forced labor and fever, the nights haunted by the screams of men who'd been caught resting or whispering after curfew. His boots had long rotted away. His uniform was a ghost of fabric. The guards called them white pigs, laughing as they beat them into motion with bamboo rods. The work was simple, in theory, carve a railway through the jungle. But the railway was a monster that devoured men faster than the guards could count them. The Japanese engineers demanded a bridge. The officers demanded progress. The camp commandant demanded obedience. And Thomas, like the others, demanded only one thing: to survive another sunrise. Across the ocean, under a very different sky, Ensign Hiroshi Takeda stood on a coastal airfield outside Kagoshima, Japan. The air was cool, smelling faintly of sea salt and engine oil. Before him sat a gleaming Mitsubishi Zero, its fuselage painted white, the color of purity. He bowed deeply, first to the aircraft, then to the rising sun flag fluttering nearby. In his breast pocket lay a letter to his mother, written in careful calligraphy. It ended with the words, "When the cherry blossoms fall, think of me." He was 21. He once wanted to be a poet. Now he was a weapon. His commanding officer, a stoic man with a scar across his cheek, read the mission orders. Intercept the American fleet approaching Leyte Gulf. Each aircraft carries a full bomb load. You will not return. The words were not cruel, merely factual. Death was a formality now. As the mechanics tightened the bolts on his plane, Hiroshi looked toward the horizon, the faint line where sea met sky. Somewhere beyond it, there were men like Thomas Bennett, men his empire called beasts, cowards, shadows. He wondered briefly if they too wrote letters home. In Burma, Thomas's fever was worsening. His friend, Corporal Andrews, whispered to him during a rare moment of rest. "They say the Japanese treat their own worse than they treat us." Thomas gave a broken laugh. Then God help them. That night, the guards dragged out a prisoner who tried to steal a handful of rice. They made the others watch, as they beat him to death with bamboo poles. The jungle swallowed his cries. Thomas stared at the blood soaking into the soil and thought, not for the first time, that civilization was just a story men told themselves to make cruelty sound reasonable. Back in Kagoshima, Hiroshi knelt before his commander as he received his hachimaki, the white headband emblazoned with the red rising sun. He tied it tightly around his forehead, not out of pride, but to keep his tears from showing. The night before his flight, he wrote another letter, this one to his younger sister. He told her the emperor's cause was just, that he would die smiling, but in the margins his handwriting wavered. He wrote, "If I am brave, it is because I am afraid." Two men, born worlds apart, now moved inexorably toward the same truth, that war devours belief as easily as it devours bodies. Thomas dreamed of escape. Hiroshi dreamed of home. And somewhere in the vast machinery of empire, both were already ghosts. The morning rain came down like needles, slicing through the sticky air as Lieutenant Thomas Bennett lifted his pick once again. The jungle around him pulsed, a breathing, living thing that watched and waited for men to fall. Mosquitoes clouded his face, the ground sucked at his feet. Every step was pain, every breath defiance. A guard's voice cracked through the humidity, "Heiaku, faster!" Followed by the slap of bamboo against bare skin. Thomas didn't flinch anymore. Pain had lost its novelty. Hunger, exhaustion, fever, they were constants like gravity. What frightened him now was how easy it had become to stop caring. To watch another man collapse and think only, one less mouth to feed. By now, the death railway had become less a construction project and more a slow-motion massacre. Men dropped by the dozens each day, cholera, dysentery, beatings, starvation. Bodies were buried beside the tracks they died to build. Sometimes, when the earth was too hard, they weren't buried at all. At night, under the flickering light of a single lantern, Thomas would trace the scars on his arms and wonder if the world would remember them. If anyone would. In his fevered dreams, he saw cities, London burning, Singapore falling, and sometimes the image of a man he'd never met, bowing before a white plane under a crimson sky. Half a world away, that very man, Ensign Hiroshi Takeda, stood on the runway, dawn rising like molten steel over the Pacific. His heart pounded with a rhythm he could no longer tell from fear or faith. The commander's voice echoed across the airfield. "To die for the Emperor is to live forever." The squadron responded as one. "Tenno Haika Banzai." Long live the Emperor. Engines roared to life. Propellers sliced the air. Hiroshi climbed into his cockpit, the familiar scent of oil and canvas filling his lungs. The controls trembled beneath his hands. He adjusted his scarf, whispered a prayer, and glanced at the small photograph taped to the dashboard, his sister, smiling beside a cherry blossom tree. Then he throttled forward. The Zero lifted off the tarmac, joining a formation of 20 other aircraft, each carrying a man who would never return. The sky over Kyushu blazed with sunlight, too beautiful for what was coming. They flew east, toward the Philippines, toward the sea where the American fleet waited. Hours passed in silence, save for the steady hum of engines and the crackle of radio static. As they neared Leyte Gulf, Hiroshi spotted the dark shapes of warships below, the vast, grey beasts of America's naval power. He could see the anti-aircraft bursts already blossoming like deadly flowers. He gripped the stick. Sweat trickled down his neck. His breath came fast. "I am the wind," he told himself. "I am the wind." And then the doubts came. What if his sacrifice changed nothing? What if this wasn't honor, but madness? What if death, promised as glory, was just silence? He could still pull up, still turn away. The horizon was endless, and freedom was only a heartbeat away. But behind him lay a country that had taught him that living after refusing to die was worse than death itself. He closed his eyes, and below, sailors screamed and scrambled to their stations. The sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft guns filled the air with fire. One shell burst near his wing, another ripped through his engine. Smoke poured into the cockpit. The ocean rose up to meet him, a blue mirror cracking open into light. In that final instant, Hiroshi thought not of the Emperor, nor of Japan. He thought of his sister, of home, of cherry blossoms falling in the spring breeze. The explosion tore through the water like thunder. The blast wave rippled across the deck of the destroyer USS St. Lo, which would sink minutes later, the first American carrier ever destroyed by a suicide attack. Back in the jungle at that same hour, Thomas Bennett collapsed. His vision swam. The world was fireflies and fog. But through the roar of blood in his ears, he heard something, a distant rumble, faint but real, the sound of bombers, maybe Allied planes, echoing high above the clouds. For the first time in months, he smiled. He thought, someone's still fighting, someone's still coming. And as darkness took him, a single thought flickered through his mind, small and defiant as a candle: I will see home again. The explosion that claimed Ensign Hiroshi Takeoff lit the sea like sunrise. Flames danced across the shattered deck of the USS St. Lo, fuel burning in floating ribbons that curled into the sky. Sailors flung themselves into the water, some on fire, some praying, all screaming. Above them, the sky still swarmed with planes, some diving, some dying, as the Pacific itself became a grave. When the fire subsided and the wreck settled beneath the waves, a stunned silence hung over the American fleet. The officers who had faced every weapon in the Japanese arsenal now stared into the ocean and realized this was something new, not strategy, not desperation, but sacrifice made into weaponry. They began calling it the Kamikaze, the divine wind. But there was nothing divine in what they'd seen, just boys in white scarves turned into fire by a nation's despair. Back in Kagoshima, Hiroshi's commander read his final letter aloud to the remaining pilots. His voice cracked only once. He met death with honor, he said. The men bowed deeply, but their eyes were hollow. The room smelled of incense and grief. One pilot whispered, "If he was so honorable, why do I feel so ashamed?" Because deep down, they knew Japan was dying. And the Kamikaze, for all their fury, could not stop the tide. The divine wind would not save the empire. It would only scatter its sons across the ocean like ashes. Thousands of miles away, the monsoon rains beat down on Burma. Lieutenant Thomas Bennett lay half-conscious in the mud, his body skeletal, his eyes sunken. The guards had grown meaner as the war turned against Japan. Food had vanished. The sick were shot to conserve rice. Yet whispers rippled through the camp. The Americans had taken the Philippines. The Japanese Navy was in retreat. The Emperor's soldiers were losing. Then one morning in August 1945, the guards vanished. Just gone. Their huts empty, the flagpole bare. No shouts, no orders, no gunfire. The POW stood blinking in the dawn, uncertain whether it was a trick. And then came the sound, not of bombs, but of silence. For the first time in years, the jungle was still. Hours later, they heard the rumor: Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Thomas fell to his knees in the mud, laughing and weeping at once. His voice cracked like dry wood. Around him, men too weak to stand crawled toward the river, staring into the flowing water as if seeing the world for the first time. When Allied paratroopers finally arrived days later, the rescuers found skeletons in rags who saluted with trembling hands. Many died within hours of liberation, their bodies unable to handle food after years of starvation. Thomas survived. He would return home weighing barely 90 pounds, but the war never left him. For the rest of his life, he flinched at sudden noises, dreamed of bamboo rods, and woke sweating in the dark. He kept one thing, though, a scrap of paper found in a Japanese officer's hut, written in kanji. A translation scribbled on the back read, "To die with honor is to live forever." He would stare at it sometimes and whisper, "No. To live, that's the hard part." For Hiroshi's sister, word came weeks later, a polite letter from the Imperial Army. Her brother had fallen gloriously in service to the Emperor. Enclosed was his headband and the photograph of her smile. She hung it on the wall beside the family altar. But each spring, when the cherry blossoms fell, she wept. Because even in death, he was still 21. And across the Pacific, Thomas Bennett planted a cherry tree in his garden, not knowing why, only that it felt right. Each spring, when the petals fell, he thought of a man he'd never met, bowing before his plane. and wondered what might have happened if both of them had been born in a world less cruel. Two men bound by the same war, one taught that honor meant death, the other that survival was guilt. Both victims of belief, both swallowed by duty. When nations go mad, it is always the ordinary men who pay the price. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, Japan was a nation of ruins, not just of buildings, but of belief. Cities lay flattened by bombs, millions were dead, and the myth of divine destiny that had driven the empire had dissolved into ash. Yet the most profound wreckage was invisible, lodged in the hearts of those who had survived. The world that emerged from that silence stared into two mirrors, one reflecting Japan's fanatic devotion, the other its unimaginable suffering. On one side, Allied soldiers told stories of atrocities in prisoner camps, starvation, torture, and forced marches that erased entire battalions. The moral line, drawn so sharply in Europe against the Nazis, blurred in the tropical jungles of Asia. On the other side, Japan's own skies had burned. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the final punctuation of total war, the instant where humanity looked at its reflection and saw both genius and monstrosity. In that uneasy peace, a strange transformation began. Japan, the nation that once preached death before dishonor, became one of the most pacifist societies on Earth. The kamikaze pilots, once worshipped as heroes, faded into ghosts. Some of their memorials still stand, quiet, overgrown, their inscriptions eroded by rain. Visitors come, bow, and leave paper cranes, unsure whether they're honoring courage or mourning madness. Historians still debate what the kamikaze meant. Were they fanatics or victims, patriots or prisoners of propaganda? The truth is tangled in both blood and poetry. Many of those young men never wanted to die. Their letters, the ones Japan tried to hide, spoke of fear, of longing, of love. "I do not wish to die," one wrote, "but if I must, let it mean something." It did. It meant everything and nothing. For the Allied prisoners who returned home, survival brought its own torment. Men like Thomas Bennett found themselves caught between silence and memory. The world wanted heroes, not haunted men. So they swallowed their stories, wore their medals like bandages, and built quiet lives in the suburbs of the peace they'd paid for. Yet time, as it always does, softened the edges of hatred. Former captives and Japanese veterans began to meet in reconciliation ceremonies. Frail men bowing to each other through tears, each acknowledging the futility of what their nations had demanded. One British POW, who had lost half his unit to starvation, clasped a Japanese officer's hand and said, "We were all prisoners of something." That was the war's final lesson, that the mind can be chained by ideology as tightly as the body can by steel. And as the decades passed, the story of the kamikaze and the POW camps became less about vengeance and more about understanding the psychology of extremity. How ordinary people can be driven to unthinkable acts when the world convinces them that death has more meaning than life. The wind that once carried burning plains now whispers across peaceful seas. The same skies that once swallowed flame now shimmer with commercial jets and starlight. And beneath them lie the bones of thousands who died believing they were immortal. Japan rebuilt not just its cities, but its conscience. It turned from worshipping war to mastering technology, philosophy, and art. Its children were taught never again to glorify death. But the ghosts remain in the rusting aircraft at Karen Peace Museum, in the names carved into stone, and in the cherry blossoms that fall each spring. Each petal a reminder of what happens when a nation forgets that honor and humanity must never part ways. And somewhere in the soil, perhaps beneath that same tree in Thomas Bennett's garden, lies the deepest truth of all, that the human spirit, broken, tested, and scarred, still seeks peace, even after walking through fire. War reveals not only what people will kill for, but what they are willing to die for. And in that distinction lies the soul of the 20th century. The Japanese kamikaze and the Allied prisoners they tormented existed in the same furnace, yet were forged by opposite illusions. Both believed they were serving a cause higher than themselves. Both were betrayed by it. The kamikaze pilots were not born zealots. They were students, poets, sons of farmers and fishermen, young men whose only sin was being told that dying beautifully could save their homeland. Their letters, when read today, do not roar with fanaticism, they tremble with sorrow. "Mother," one wrote, "I will fly tomorrow. The cherry blossoms are in bloom, I wish I could see them again." That line breaks history open. It reminds us that these were not monsters, but boys coerced by myth. The Empire of Japan had crafted a spiritual machine, a culture where honor was currency and surrender was sin. When the machinery of empire devoured its own children, it called it sacrifice. On the other side of the barbed wire, Allied prisoners endured another distortion of humanity, the reduction of man to meat. The Japanese guards, indoctrinated to see captives as beneath dignity, enacted cruelty not from sadism alone, but from a system that demanded it. To show mercy was to betray the emperor. To hesitate was weakness. The true horror of those camps was not merely the starvation or beatings, but the normalization of evil, how brutality became routine, how empathy was methodically dismantled until only obedience remained. And yet, amid that ruin, fragments of light endured. Prisoners risked death to share a crust of rice. Kamikaze pilots helped each other write farewell letters they would never see delivered. Even at the edge of annihilation, the human heart insisted on kindness, small acts of rebellion against the vast machinery of ideology. That is the paradox of war. The same species that invents the bomb also invents forgiveness. When historians debate whether the kamikaze were heroes or victims, or whether Japan's crimes outweighed its suffering, they are really grappling with a deeper question: how thin the line is between faith and fanaticism. The lesson of that era is not that some people are evil by nature, but that entire nations can be taught to sanctify death if they are afraid enough. Modern warfare, with its drones and digital detachment, makes killing almost clean. Yet the psychology remains the same. Every generation must confront the temptation to turn belief into armor and obedience into virtue. What the kamikaze and the POWs remind us is that morality is not a weapon or a strategy. It's a fragile thread stretched between conscience and survival. Once it snaps, civilization itself begins to unravel. And so every spring, when cherry blossoms drift across Japan, soft, silent, ephemeral, they are not merely symbols of beauty. They are ghosts of a past where beauty and death were indistinguishable. Each petal that falls whispers a warning older than nations. Never worship war, never romanticize death. Because the greatest courage is not in dying for one's country, it is in living despite it.